Hi, my name is Heather Costello, and I am one of your instructional coaches. I am making this video to give you a little bit more information about the Phonics Core program. This is going to be a little welcome and an introduction to the Phonics Core program. Hopefully it'll answer some of your questions you might have concerning this program. Now, one of the first things, though, we're not going to be answering this question, what? Or I'm not going to be able to answer right now the questions how, but for this video, we're really going to focus on answering those why questions you might have. And some of those questions might look like this. Why are we as a district implementing this phonics curriculum? Or maybe you have this question. Why would I want to change what I am currently teaching to include systematic phonics instruction? Or why are we going to all this trouble and investing so much of our resources in this? You know, when you look at all these questions, what they're really asking you, what you are really asking is this going to be worth it? And I hope that this video could kind of help you see that we think it really will. But to do this, we're going to look at this. We're going to be looking at some research creating systematic phonics. Now, a lot of this research you're probably well familiar with and you might know, but I'm going to try to put it together so it makes a little bit more sense. And we're not only going to look at one piece of research, but we're going to look at multiple different kinds of research. We're going to look at systematic phonics through a couple different lenses. The first lens is going to be look at systematic phonics research through a comparative lens. And then we'll look at systematic phonics through a balanced literacy lens. Then we'll look at systematic phonics research through our brain research lens. Then we'll look at some orthographic mathing research concerning systematic phonics. And last, we'll look at some dyslexia research concerning why we might want to do systematic phonics. And hopefully at the end, you'll be able to see a little more understanding of why we believe this is going to be worth it. So first to the research. First, one of the things you might want to know is that historically, phonics is one of those items that has been heavily studied to see, is it really worth it? But we're not going to go that far back into the history. We're just going to go first to the 1980s and 1990s. Because at this time, there was quite a bit of research going on about it. At this time was the reading wars, and you had the whole language method of teaching literacy, and then you had the systematic phonics of teaching literacy. The phonics people were believing in helping with literacy, saying that it's letter by letter. Children learn to read by learning each sound, and they go through each sound. However, the whole language theorists of teaching their theory of literacy was no. Literacy is learned by how language is learned. You just have to be in the environment. And anyways, we learn it by the whole letter anyways. We don't learn it letter by letter. That was kind of what the whole language were people. And it was really interesting that when the whole language methodology came and people would describe that whole language methodology as coming onto the scene in two different ways. They first described it as a wave. It just came through and everybody was changing. Another way they described it was as a wildfire. It just burned through and everybody started changing until it started falling apart. And California was the state that really took hold onto this whole language. And then as soon as their fourth grade test scores kind of fell through the floor, then we see that everything kind of fell apart for the whole language people. But it kind of threw everything into chaos of what should be doing. So the government said this, listen, we need to know how Johnny knows how to read. So they created the National Reading Panel, a specialized panel of experts. It was about in the year 2000, they gave the report saying, what is really going to be the best way that Johnny can learn how to read, and what should we really be doing? So David N. Langberg, he was the chair of the National Reading Panel, and he said this. The panel concluded that the research literature provides solid evidence that phonics instruction produces significant benefits for children having difficult learning to read. The greatest improvements were seen from a systematic phonics instruction when it was compared to the whole language instruction. Now, he also said this. This type of phonics instruction consists of teaching a planned sequence of phonics elements rather than highlighted elements as they happen to appear in text. Now, he also said this. The panel concluded that systematic and explicit instruction in phonemic awareness should be an important component of classroom reading instruction. And he said that systematic phonics instruction is appropriate for the routine classroom instruction. So this wasn't a problem that was just occurring in the United States, but this problem was occurring worldwide. So England was also having a problem, and so they also did a national report, a very in-depth study. It was called the Rose Report, and in the Rose Report, they decided, yes, systematic phonics over whole language provides better literacy instruction. Also, at the same time, Australia. Australia did a national report, and again, systematic phonics wins. Now, this was back in the years of 2000, but you can now go to the International Literacy Association site. You will see lots and lots of up-to-date research that says, yes, you should have systematic phonics as a part, and that would be a benefit if you had that in your curriculum. I share that National Reading Panel report because that is probably one of the biggest and probably the most famous pieces of research that you can probably find on systematic phonics. Now, the important thing, though, is to remember that each one of those national gigantic reports, they had one thing that you have to remember when you're doing systematic phonics, and they had this. They said this: systematic phonics should not be used alone, and it should be part of a balanced literacy program. Well, then it makes you ask, well, what do you mean by balanced literacy, and how are we supposed to do that? First, you have to know this. Balanced literacy doesn't look like this. It has nothing to do with this, and it doesn't look like this. It definitely has nothing to do with this, and absolutely for sure, it has nothing to do with percentages. So what does a balanced literacy program really look like if structured phonics is supposed to be a part of it? Well, it's all based on what a child needs. What does your student need is depending on how much of that structured phonics you're going to really use. And we know that we can know that through assessment. But we can also look at what the research says about what it should look like. Now, a really good piece of research is Scarborough's research, Hollis Scarborough. Now, this again is back in the 2000s, but this is seminal. Her research is seminal research. And she describes balanced literacy as looking like a rope, probably one of the most famous graphics in literacy, describing literacy, that you'll probably ever find. And she says this: it does look like a rope. Skilled reading is the fluent execution and coordination of word recognition and text comprehension. That means when students are reading, all of it is working at the same time. It's all intertwined, and it's all helping each other twine together to make that reading occur. Now, she says this: when teaching reading, you teach all the elements. However, there are certain parts of the rope that may need to be emphasized, not in totality, but may need to be emphasized more at different times according to a developing reader's needs. Okay, so let's look more closely at her note and about this emphasizing part. First, this is her rope. She puts the elements of reading instruction into two big categories. The first you have is your language comprehension category. That's your vocabulary, your background knowledge, semantics, syntactics, verbal reasoning, and literature knowledge. Then her other part, she says that it's working at the same time, is your word recognition part. Now, this part, look, it looks familiar, doesn't it? That's the Phonics Core part. In fact, a lot of people, Phonics Core is really, you could call it Graphophonics Core because it's including everything that's in the graphophonics system that gives us the cueing system of how a person reads. Also, you could call the Phonics Core a word recognition curriculum because it doesn't just include phonics. It has all of it that we need for that word recognition. Now, notice also that Scarborough says on this part, it needs to become increasingly automatic. Now, as she says that all of these parts are working together all the time, however, she does say that the emphasis on how and when and how much you teach these parts, it's going to change a little bit. It's never going to be totally one part, but you're going to have emphasis on certain parts depending on the reader's development. So let's look at how she describes that. First, she says birth through pre-K. Reading, literacy development, it starts at birth. So what part are we going to need to emphasize most to get the most movement from our students or most movement from the children? It's that background knowledge of vocabulary, lots and lots of talking, lots and lots of language, verbal reasoning, and sharing literacy. Very little of other thing else. Now, if you look at the research, do other research agree with her? Yes. If you look at Hart and Risley, which is seminal research, the 30 million word research, they say yes. And if you look at Suskind was updated. Hart and Risley's research, wrote this book about how important that part of the strand is to those birth and pre-K. Excellent book right here to read. Now, but when you look at that, you say, wait, so this is what balanced literacy looks like in a pre-K to almost kindergarten. And that's true. That's what it should be because that's what the needs of those students are. So to me, this is what a balanced literacy looks like for a pre-K. Now let's go to the next part. Scarborough says this: in the kindergarten and in the early years, first, second, and maybe into third, depending on if the child needs it, this is the part that should not be in totality, but should get more emphasis. You're going to get more bang for your buck. You're going to get more movement from your students if you will emphasize and really emphasize this part of your instruction. And that is her word recognition strands, the phonological awareness, the decoding, and the sight word recognition. Everything that we see right in that phonics core right there. She says that is going to give the most bang for your buck if we really focus on that, not in totality again, but you have an emphasis on that in the kinder and those early skill years. And you need to be doing that until it becomes, those skills become automatic and you get quite a bit of automaticity. So you say, well, is other researchers saying that? Yes. If you look at brain research, let's go and look at brain research for a second. And if you go to Professor, it's Dehaene, I believe. He is a French cognitive neuroscientist. Now, if you want to get some of this information that I'm sharing with you, can go to YouTube. This information is taken from a presentation at the World Innovation Summit for Education, and he shares this information. In fact, you'll see some of the slides here on the film. So this is what he says. First, he says, yes, language is the most important thing to focus on when a child is born and young, those pre. But he says then it needs to change because language, our brains are made for language. They are absolutely made. But reading, no. Reading is as an invention. Our brains are not made to read. In fact, they have to have huge anatomical changes have to happen in our brains to even allow us to read. Huge anatomical things, different structures of the brains have to actually be changed so we can read. So when you read, your brain looks very different from a person's brain that doesn't know how to read. Now, why is it important that these changes occur? Because look right here. Look over in the sounds. Look at that little sounds area. That part's in the brain, but that letter part, that part where it says letters, that part actually has to change from something that it was used for differently before then. And those little yellow lines back and forth, those little yellow lines have to go back and forth, and you have to make super strong connections. It actually has to grow these connections to actually make reading possible. You have to change your brain. And he says the only way that you can actually make these dramatic changes that happen is to teach letter sound correspondences. And you need to teach them systematically and directly. It is essential, he says, for reading. Now, what's interesting, he says, is that in Italy, one of the easiest languages to read, in Italy, it only takes a year because all of their rules are very systematic. They're regular. They don't have irregularities. It's easy. But he says English is one of the hardest languages to learn to read because we have so many irregularities. So when he says you have to teach those letter sound correspondences, it's not just A says A, B says B, C says K. You have to teach all the others, the blends, the vowel teams, the regular verbs. You have to teach those. And because you need to teach those, and because the brain actually has to change and grow from teaching those, it's going to take you an extra 2 years. An extra 2 years if you're learning to read in English, where in Russian and Italian, where the rules are pretty consistent, it only takes 1 year. Now, do other researchers also agree with what Dehaene is saying? Yes. This is Louisa Moats. Louisa Moats is a pretty big name in literacy research. She wrote the book on speech to print. Here it is. She wrote the book on speech to print. This is the second edition, which came out in 2019. She has already wrote her third edition, and this one is actually not even that old. Now, what she says in speech to print, I recommend this book. I don't know if I would recommend this. This is a very technical book. It's a long book. The first chapter is really good. It's really interesting, but the rest is a whole bunch of research. And she says, yes, systematic phonics is an important part of your curriculum if you're going to actually get speech to print. And she goes, if you want more of the research, you can read more of this. Her first chapter, though, is excellent. Hey, now let's go back to Scarborough and back to that developmental reading. Now, that next phase of reading, after you get that automaticity in those word recognition skills, now Scarborough says you go back to that language comprehension, because having that automaticity in those word recognition skills is going to lower the cognitive load on the brain so that you can have better comprehension skills, and the comprehension skills will come faster and more fluent. Not that we're ever teaching anything as in singularity, only by itself. Everything's taught the same. We're talking about emphasis. Not anything is taught in only totality in just one, but it now goes back to the comprehension strands. And that should be easier because, as I said, you gain the automaticity in those word recognition skills. So now it's better having they have better comprehension, and now you can focus more on that, and that will give you your biggest bang for your buck in your reading instruction. So, does the brain research person say this too? Yes, he actually does. Here's another one of his slides. And he says this, that what's circled in the red. He says, brain research converges with educational research here. Teaching letter sound correspondences is the fastest way to acquiring reading and comprehension. See how you have those little yellow lines back and forth with the sounds and the letters? Now you can have more connections that will help. Having those lines, he says, actually will help you increase a child's comprehension and gain the meaning that we need in reading. So Scarsborough's rope really does coordinate with the brain research that we see now and Professor DeHaan's research. Now, I want to say one more thing that's interesting that Professor DeHaan teaches in his seminar. He teaches this. I think it's very interesting. Phonics is superior to whole word training. And look at this. He says people do not learn, children or adults do not learn by looking at a whole word. Let me go through some of the things that he actually says. He says this: children and adults read letter by letter, and they always read letter by letter. Whole word reading is a myth, and people always read by processing letter by letter. In adults, they get to do it so fast they call it parallel reading. Then, when doing whole word reading, you may be training the brain to attend and activate in the wrong areas. And if you're doing this, it's an inefficient way to teach sight words. So, let's talk about sight words now. In the Phonics Core Curriculum, they don't even like you to call it sight words. They said, please use high frequency words because we don't want to teach them as sight words since that's not really an effective way to do it. Using a just look at it whole word approach is ineffective according to the brain research. Instead, what the brain really does is they use what's called orthographic mapping. It orthographs and maps that word sound by sound. Now, orthographic mapping, it's not a method to teach sight word, and it's not an approach to teach sight words. It's a process that children use, whether you like it or not. It's the process a children uses to understand words that are unfamiliar to them. They first have the image in their long-term memory of what that word means. And then in their long-term memory, they have the sounds of what it means. And then they try to connect that to the words, at least the words they know of the word, before they connect to the words the letters that they don't understand are in the word. And as you look at the Phonics Core and you look at how they do sight words, you're going to say, wait, why are we using phonics in this? Because they're trying to align with a child's orthographic mapping process, what they're going to use anyway. And so as you look at that and how they teach the sight words in this Phonics Core, it's going along with the brain research. So go along with how they teach the sight words because you will be going along with brain research. Now, when you talk about orthographic mapping, this person, Kendrick, his name comes up quite a few times in there, and you'll see his name on. I just wanted to add some of his research because what he says I thought was really interesting when you compare it to what the Phonics Core is doing in our curriculum. Kilpatrick suggests that as students move into grades 2 and 3, they need to become proficient in more advanced phonemic awareness skills to apply the orthographic mapping process. Now, you are only going to get advanced phonemic awareness skills when you do a systematic phonics program. And he says this as the why. If a student can do a phoneme manipulation task with ease, example, deleting, substituting, reversing phonemes, it indicates a higher level of proficiency with phonemes, which is correlated with word reading more than blending and segmenting. Now that's skill 5 in the PAL lessons, not the PLL lessons, but the PAL lessons, the phonemic awareness lessons. That is all skill 5. And that's what you get when you're doing a systematic phonics curriculum, is you get those high levels phonemic manipulation skills that they actually really need for reading. I thought that was interesting that he would say that. Okay, now let's go to our next piece of research. and that is dyslexia. Now, when you look at dyslexia, the best places to go for research is going to be, for sure, the International Dyslexia Association site. They have the best mass of research for help people with dyslexia. But also you're going to go to Sally Shaywitz. Now, she wrote the book. And that's the book right there of what people with dyslexia need to help them read. Now, both of these people, Sally Shaywitz and the International Dyslexia Association, they both say, listen, you need systematic phonics. They both heavily suggest and recommend systematic phonics. Now, you might be saying, well, wait, that's great that it should be for dyslexics, but that means we should keep systematic phonics in our intervention areas of our curriculum. And that would be no. One of the reasons is this. Dyslexia happens in 1 in 5. It's 1 in 5 children that have dyslexia. Also this, 80% of children with dyslexia are not identified while in school. Another thing to consider would be this. Dyslexia is identified on a spectrum, meaning this. When a child has dyslexia, you can have mild dyslexia to severe dyslexia, but you can also have this. Before a child is actually diagnosed with dyslexia, they have to have this and this and this and this and this and this and this. All of these red flags, all of this evidence, all of these characteristics before they finally say, okay, you've crossed the threshold, you met our needs, you met the evidence, you have dyslexia. The problem is you have all these other children right here. They might not have had as many red flags. They might not have had all these characteristics, but they still have these dyslexic thinking patterns. And not only these people up here, the ones that have dyslexia can be helped with systematic phonics, but these people here that have some of the characteristics systematic phonics should also help them. And these people, some of these children are in your classroom for sure. Now, let's get to one last point. My last point is this. In looking at everything concerning systematic phonics, and is this really going to be worth it? Is this something we really want to do? I think there's one thing that we really have to consider that's just important. There's one thing that I think is really going to make or break it. Is this really going to be worth it? Are we going to really see these big increases? And that one thing is going to be this. It's going to be you. The research is super thick on this. In fact, it is so thick that I shouldn't say the word has. I shouldn't make a deterministic type of statement, but I'm going to because I believe it is so thick. And it's this statement right here. The quality of a teacher has a significant impact on student achievement, and it can be a multi-year effect. The research says up to 3 years. So what I'm saying with the statement is this. How you implement systematic phonics, that's really going to be making the difference if this is really going to work or not. I believe, and the research shows, I believe it's very thick on this, that you are the most important variable in how this is going to do and how well is this going to work. How you teach this systematic phonics is going to be crucial. So I suggest this. Use your strengths, use your resources, use the awesome teacherness that you have in implementing it. Because if you do, I really think this can make the difference and really at least make a difference to help our students in their reading. Thank you. Thank you for all you do in using your strengths in doing this. And thank you for your time and good luck. If there is anything that we coaches could do to help you with this, in implementing, if you have any questions, we would love to help you with this. Thank you for your time and good luck with this new program.